What I see in NATO's current fractures is not a military setback. It is a surrender, a slow, deliberate, 30-year-in-the-making surrender. And Russia did not need to fire a single missile at a NATO member state to achieve it. Every week, the television coverage shows you the same map, the same front lines, the same casualty counts. And if you consume only that coverage, you leave each broadcast believing the war is still balanced, still undecided, that the right weapons package, the right funding vote, the right policy from the right capital could still change the trajectory. But there is a second war running parallel to the one on that map. A structural war, a war of institutional erosion, of alliance fatigue, of political coherence slowly hollowing from the inside. And that war, the one the cameras are not pointed at, has already produced a winner. The conclusion is not what Washington is telling you, and it is not what Moscow is admitting either. But the documented evidence, the sourced numbers, and 30 years of alliance history point to the same uncomfortable place. By the end of this analysis, you will understand the architecture of what is actually breaking apart. The real mechanisms, the real timeline, the real strategic logic, better than the overwhelming majority of analysts currently covering this conflict. Most of them are watching the front line. What you need to watch is the alliance itself, and that picture is far more alarming than anything happening in the Donbass. The analytical framework I want to use for this is what strategic planners call the alliance decay model. 3 interlocking mechanisms, and when all 3 fail simultaneously, no alliance in recorded history has recovered without a fundamental restructuring. Mechanism 1, the credibility gap, the distance between what an alliance promises and what it actually delivers. Mechanism 2, the burden rift, the growing imbalance between what each member pays and what each member expects to receive. Mechanism 3, and this is the one no one is discussing, the exit premium, the precise point at which leaving the alliance costs a member government less, politically and economically, than staying inside it. NATO is currently failing all 3 at the same time, and I want you to hold that thought, because the number I am about to give you is what makes that triple failure not just possible, but structurally inevitable. Here is the anchor number. According to NATO's own Secretary General annual report, published in 2024, U.S. defense spending accounted for 55% of total NATO combined expenditure in 2023. One country, 32 members, more than half the load carried by one, and that number has been climbing for a decade straight. Now here is what that number does not tell you on its own, because the raw figure is only half the story. The other half is what happened to the countries on the other side of that ledger. What happened to the European economies that were supposed to eventually close that gap? What happened to them is the reason this alliance is fracturing right now. And that story begins not in 2022, not in 2014, it begins in 1949, with a design flaw that was visible from day one. NATO was not built to be permanent. Most people do not know that. It was constructed in 1949 as a temporary deterrent, a short-term security architecture designed to hold Soviet expansion westward while Europe excavated itself from the rubble of World War II. The expectation of its original architects was that European members would eventually build their own collective defense capacity and reduce the load on Washington. Lord Hastings Ismay, NATO's first Secretary General, summarized the alliance's founding logic in one sentence that has been documented in historical archives. Keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. That is not diplomacy. That is triage. It was never designed to be a 75-year arrangement. And here is what makes that directly relevant to 2025. Every condition that justified America's permanent military presence in Europe, Soviet military supremacy, a shattered European economy, the absence of European political unity, none of those conditions exist any longer. The European Union's combined GDP stood at approximately $18.4 trillion as of 2023, according to World Bank data. That makes Europe the world's second largest economic bloc. Germany alone spends more on domestic social welfare per year than Russia spends on its entire defense apparatus. So the question that strategic analysts have been sitting with, carefully, quietly, because the answer is uncomfortable, is this: if Europe can genuinely afford to defend itself, why has it not? The RAND Corporation's 2023 report on European strategic autonomy provided an answer that unsettled Western policymakers. The report found that European defense culture had become, in their exact phrasing, dependency optimized, meaning European governments had structured their entire security architecture around American guarantees, in a way that made independent capability building politically unattractive. They built a system where relying on America was cheaper, easier, and more domestically popular than building their own capacity. Russia understood this architecture before most Europeans did. General Valery Gerasimov, chief of the Russian General Staff, published what became known as the Gerasimov Doctrine in a 2013 article in the Russian journal Military Industrial Courier. The central proposition of that piece was this: modern conflict is decided not through military confrontation alone, but through the deliberate erosion of an adversary's political will, economic coherence, and internal consensus. That is not a theory. That is a working playbook. And the proof that it has been executing successfully is not in Ukraine. It is in something that happened at a campaign rally in February 2024. And what was said at that rally changed the strategic calculation of every single NATO member government on the planet. What was said at that rally did not just embarrass America's allies. It exposed a structural weakness inside the alliance that Russia had been quietly engineering for 20 years. And the response from European capitals revealed something far more alarming than the statement itself. In February 2024, at a campaign event in Conway, South Carolina, Donald Trump, then the leading Republican presidential candidate, now the President of the United States, said that he would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they want to any NATO ally that did not meet its financial commitments to the alliance. Read that again, slowly. The leading candidate for the most powerful elected office in the Western world publicly signaled to Moscow that collective defense guarantees are not legal obligations, not moral imperatives. They are conditional, transactional, subject to review. The response from European governments was immediate, and that immediate response is the evidence I want you to examine closely. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz called it irresponsible. French President Emmanuel Macron elevated his rhetoric around European strategic autonomy to a level of urgency it had never previously carried. Polish defense officials, Poland being the NATO member currently spending the most on defense as a share of GDP at 4% in 2024, the highest in the entire alliance, began accelerating expansion timelines that were already aggressive. But beneath those public statements, something else happened. Something the press releases did not capture. The European reaction fractured along a fault line that had been building for a decade. On one side, the eastern flank. Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, which joined NATO in April 2023 after a century of careful neutrality, countries that share a land border with Russia and for whom American commitment cannot be conditional under any circumstances. On the other side, the Western core. France, Germany, Italy, Spain, countries whose populations, according to a February 2024 survey by the European Council on Foreign Relations across 12 EU member states, show majority sentiment in favor of a negotiated settlement in Ukraine, even one that involves Ukrainian territorial concessions. That survey found that 41% of Italians, 37% of Germans, and 33% of French citizens preferred their governments to prioritize peace negotiations over military victory, not because they support Russia, but because the economic cost of this conflict had landed on their household budgets in a way that the news cycle consistently failed to document. And this is where your grocery bill enters the story. The sanctions campaign launched against Russia in February 2022 was designed with one stated objective: collapse the Russian economy, isolate Russia financially, force the ruble into free fall, and create domestic pressure on the Kremlin from inside. The ruble did fall, briefly. It then recovered. But the sanctions produced a second consequence that Western governments did not fully model. They severed European access to cheap Russian energy at the precise moment when European economies were already absorbing post-pandemic inflation. In the fourth quarter of 2022, Germany's industrial electricity prices rose by 65%, according to Eurostat data. German industrial output, the engine of the European economy, the largest manufacturing base on the continent, fell by 2% across 2023, according to Germany's Federal Statistical Office. The chemical sector, the automotive sector, the precision manufacturing sector, all contracting. And Russia's economy? The International Monetary Fund revised Russia's GDP growth upward in its October 2024 World Economic Outlook to 3.6% for the year. Higher than Germany, higher than France, higher than Italy, higher than every major Western European economy without exception. The sanctions did not break Russia. They fractured European industrial competitiveness instead. That outcome was not engineered by Moscow. It emerged from Western policy choices. But its political consequences are now feeding directly into the divisions inside the alliance, giving leaders like Hungary's Viktor Orbán and Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico a domestic economic argument for their obstruction of European consensus on Ukraine. Orbán has blocked EU aid packages to Ukraine on 4 separate occasions since 2022. Fico, elected in late 2023 explicitly on a platform of ending military support to Ukraine, has consistently undermined collective European positions at the Council level, Turkey, a NATO member since 1952, maintained trade relations with Russia throughout the war, serving as a transit hub for sanctioned goods, according to a 2024 report from the Kiev School of Economics. These are not outliers making noise on the periphery. They are symptoms of a system reaching its structural tolerance limit. Now consider what those symptoms look like from Moscow's planning perspective, because the picture that assembles itself from there is not a Russia under siege. It is a Russia watching an alliance come apart, without committing a single soldier against it. Here is the part that nobody on television will say plainly, and the reason they will not say it out loud is precisely the reason you need to hear it now. The war Russia has already won is not Ukraine. Let me be precise about what that means. The military conflict in Ukraine remains active and unresolved. As of early 2025, front lines have shifted incrementally. The war's military outcome is genuinely uncertain. That part of the analysis is still open. I am not making a claim about what happens on the battlefield. The war that has already produced a winner is structural. It is a war of institutional erosion, alliance credibility, and political coherence. And on those measures, the documented evidence points in one direction. Here is the gap narrative. Official statement. From the NATO Washington Summit Communiqué, July 2024, the alliance has achieved historic unity and unprecedented resolve in the face of Russian aggression. Observable reality 1. The United States, under its current administration in 2025, reopened direct bilateral negotiations with Russia without requiring European partners to be meaningfully present in the room. Multilateral alliance frameworks were effectively bypassed. Observable reality 2. European member states have been unable to produce a coherent, unified position on what an acceptable negotiated settlement looks like, because their domestic political pressures pull in directions that are fundamentally incompatible with each other. Observable reality 3. The artillery shells that were promised, the F-16 transfer timelines that were announced, the Patriot battery deployments that were committed to, each arrived months or years behind schedule, according to delivery tracking data published by the Kiel Institute for the World Economy through November 2024. That gap between the announced unity and the observable fragmentation is not a communications failure. It is not a messaging problem. It is the structural signature of an alliance that has reached the outer limit of its political coherence. Every serious student of alliance history recognizes this pattern. The League of Nations did not collapse because it lacked founding principles. It collapsed because its most powerful potential member, the United States, refused to ratify the covenant. And once that anchor commitment became uncertain, every other member began calculating their obligations relative to the commitment of the member next to them. The architecture was principled. The political will that was supposed to inhabit it was not. NATO is not the League of Nations. The parallel is imprecise. But the mechanism, a dominant power signaling conditional commitment, triggering a cascade of hedging behavior across secondary members, that mechanism is identical in both cases. Before we continue, something deserves a full stop. More than 10,000 Ukrainian civilians have been confirmed killed since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022, according to the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, with the actual toll assessed to be significantly higher due to persistent documentation gaps in active combat zones. More than 6 million Ukrainians remain registered as refugees across Europe as of January 2025, according to the UNHCR. These are not statistics. These are people, families with names, children who grew up in Kharkiv, in Mariupol, in Kherson, who have now spent 3 consecutive winters in displacement. Every alliance calculation, every summit communique, every bilateral negotiation that follows from this analysis sits on top of that human reality. It deserves to be acknowledged before we continue. Now, to the scenario that keeps European strategic planners awake at night. If American commitment to NATO becomes formally conditional, if Article 5 guarantees are structurally linked to meeting spending thresholds, the probability that at least 2 Baltic state members face direct Russian political or military pressure within a decade rises, according to analysts at the European Council on Foreign Relations in their 2024 long-range risk assessment, to between 40 and 50%. 40 to 50%. For countries that spent 50 years under Soviet control. For democracies that spent 3 decades building the institutional foundations that authoritarian systems cannot tolerate next to their borders. And Russia does not need to invade the Baltic states to achieve its strategic objective. It only needs European governments to believe the guarantee is uncertain. The shadow of possible abandonment, the credible perception that America might not come, is sufficient to generate the political accommodation and strategic hedging that fragments Western unity over time. Vladimir Putin said this almost explicitly in his 2007 address at the Munich Security Conference, delivered 18 months before Russia entered Georgia. The speech was a direct articulation of the strategic logic. Russia does not need to win every military engagement. It needs the West to lose confidence in its own institutional commitments. By every documented measure currently available, that campaign is producing results. Step back from the specific mechanisms for a moment, because here is what all of this, the burden rift, the credibility gap, the economic backfire, the conditional commitment, actually means for the next 10 years of global order. What I want you to take from this analysis is not fear. Fear is not a useful output. Fear closes down your ability to think clearly at the precise moment you need it most. What is useful is the map. And when you have the map, when you understand the real mechanisms, the documented pattern, the historical precedent, you can see what is likely to happen before the headline announces it. So let me give you the counter-argument first, and because it is a serious one and it deserves a fair hearing. Smart analysts with genuine credentials look at everything laid out here and reach a significantly calmer conclusion. Their case rests on 3 pillars, and all 3 are real. First, European defense spending is genuinely and meaningfully rising. Poland at 4% of GDP is not symbolic. It is the beginning of a structural shift in European strategic culture. Finland's military integration into NATO adds a 1,340-kilometer land border with Russia that fundamentally changes Moscow's northern calculus. Sweden's accession completes a Scandinavian security architecture that effectively closes the Baltic Sea to Russian naval projection. Second, Ukraine has not been defeated. Against Russian timelines that anticipated Kiev falling within 72 hours in February 2022, the Ukrainian military held, adapted, and in some sectors advanced. That resistance has imposed documented costs on the Russian military that were not part of the initial Kremlin model. Third, the European defense industrial base is expanding. The EU's European Defense Fund, the ASAP artillery shell production initiative, the Czech-led ammunition procurement mechanism, these are not symbolic gestures. They are the early infrastructure of an independent European defense capacity that could, over 15 to 20 years, meaningfully reduce the structural dependency on American guarantees. Those 3 pillars are real. Acknowledge them. But here is what makes the counter-argument insufficient rather than wrong. The timeline for European defense self-sufficiency, even under the most optimistic projections, is 15 to 20 years. The timeline for the political fractures currently visible inside NATO is now, this year, this quarter. The exit premium calculation for member governments like Hungary and Slovakia is happening in real time, not in a policy paper. The Polish military may reach full operational capacity by 2035. The coherence problem is a 2025 problem. That asymmetry between the speed at which decay accelerates and the speed at which structural remedies take hold is the core of the strategic risk this analysis is describing. And there is one more variable the optimistic counter-argument does not adequately account for. Russia is not trying to defeat NATO in a military engagement. That was never the primary objective. The objective is to make NATO irrelevant, to make European governments calculate individually that accommodating Russian interests is less costly than confronting them. And that calculation changes the moment American commitment becomes genuinely uncertain. The doomsday clock, maintained by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, was set to 89 seconds to midnight in January 2025, the closest it has been in 77 years of continuous measurement. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world came to nuclear war during the entire Cold War, the clock stood at 7 minutes. We are now measurably closer to that threshold than at any point during the most dangerous standoff of the 20th century. That is not a metaphor. That is the collective judgment of physicists, former heads of state, and intelligence professionals whose specific job is to maintain that clock. So here is what to watch. Watch whether the United States formally restructures its Article 5 language in 2025 or 2026. Watch whether Hungary and Slovakia begin coordinating their obstruction, because 2 members blocking in coordination is a structural problem, not a political nuisance. Watch whether any major Western European government opens a bilateral economic conversation with Moscow that excludes Brussels. Those 3 developments will tell you which direction this resolves before any headline announces it. Wars almost never start because everyone decided they wanted one. They start because nobody watched the dominoes fall until it was too late.